This is for Palestine, Ramallah, West Bank, Gaza. This is for the child that is searching for an answer. Wish I could take your tears and replace them with laughter. Long live Palestine, long live Gaza. Palestine, Ramallah, West Bank, Gaza. This is for the child that is searching for an answer. Wish I could take your tears and replace them with laughter. Long live Palestine.
We're really pleased to have three extraordinary organizers and activists who have dedicated an enormous amount of their life and life's blood to Palestine. I'm going to introduce them in alphabetical order, and then I'll tell you the order they're going to speak. The first is Suzanne Abulhawa, who is an award-winning novelist, activist, mother, poet, director of the Palestine Rights Literature Festival, which just concluded in Philadelphia last month, and also the founder of Playgrounds for Palestine. She's written 3 novels, Against the Loveless World and Mornings in Jenin. I think last night she was helping to lead a massive rally in Philadelphia in protest of the current bombing regime in Israel. Susan will be speaking third tonight. The second person I will introduce is Suzanne Adely. Suzanne is a member of the National Lawyers Guild and International Association of Democratic Lawyers and the U.S. Palestinian Community Network. Again, another long-time organizer and activist with expertise that actually Palestinians always need when it comes to fighting international law and American law as it relates to the right to resist. And then our third speaker, who will be speaking first tonight, is Johnny Hazboun. Johnny is a Palestinian born and raised in Jordan. He's a long-time committed activist and organizer giving to his community, has worked in refugee camps as a supporter of the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement. He is currently a student at Purdue University and president of the chapter of Purdue Students for Justice in Palestine. I was just at an amazing rally that Johnny organized Friday night with hundreds of people on campus. He's doing really brilliant work. So honored, happy to have all of you here. I'm going to ask Johnny to begin speaking, and in about 10 minutes, we'll switch over to Suzanne and then finally to Susie. So thank you all again for being here. And Johnny, please go ahead and take it away.
Hi, everyone. I want to thank all of you guys for being here, and the editor crew of Puntorojo for hosting this. This is very much needed, and thank you everyone for being here. As Bill mentioned, I am Johnny Hazboun. I'm a Palestinian, born and raised in Jordan, and I've spent a big portion of my life advocating and talking about Palestine. I've worked and volunteered in countless refugee camps to help refugees, to educate them about the cause, how they can help, what they should do. I've also been a long-time supporter and part of the BDS movement and campaign in Jordan. We worked on the boycott of the electricity, the gas deals, the water deals, a lot of stuff that in the Jordanian. And also more recently, I'm the president of the Students for Justice in Palestine chapter at Purdue University, where we organize and educate the campus and mobilize people towards advocating for Palestine. Just to talk about the recent issues that happen, one thing we've been saying the past couple of weeks as we're advocating for this is that the biggest enemy we're facing right now is the misinformation happening, and misinformation through the media, the misinformation that people are receiving and how people are viewing the situation. And I think it all starts with October 7, when it all started with the reaction by resistance fighters in Gaza when the attacks happened inside the 1948 occupied Palestinian territories. And the word reaction is very important because the Western media likes to frame it as an attack or as an action done without any justification, that it's an action that was done. And it points down to the right to resist. It was not unprovoked action that was done. It was a very reactionary response. If you get a cat, you corner it for 16 years, it will scratch you. If you get anything and corner it for 16 years, it will scratch you. It's a basic animal and human instinct that if you are attacked, you will react. And the Palestinian people have been occupied for 75 years. And more specifically, the people of Gaza have been under siege, complete siege, for over 16 years, with lack of basic human rights. basic human rights, human needs, a lack of everything, pretty much. And it has been called the world's biggest open-air prison. And the people in Gaza have constantly been resisting and constantly. And they've tried all approaches of diplomacy, of peaceful. We had the March of Return protests that happened a couple of years ago, which were completely peaceful. And the people of Gaza were still being killed, bombed, imprisoned, and all of that. And in October 7, Gaza decided to react to the situation. And they have been met with that the situation has been getting worse by the minute, by the second. And the attack and the siege has only gotten worse. And it has really been very sad to see how the world has been framing this as, oh, yeah, they deserve it. Even if you could ignore everything about that, at the end of the day, the war crimes happening are like the world has decided these are war crimes. There's international law, there's not being upheld. And the war crimes we are seeing, and people are still saying, oh, well, but Gaza started it, and not looking at the history of what happened and the right of the people of Gaza to resist their occupation, which has been lasting for 75 years in Palestine and 16-year siege of Gaza. And it is very sad to see how people uphold the right to resist for the Ukrainian people, which rightfully so, the Ukrainian people have a right to resist. But for example, when you go to Palestinians, the people who are resisting in Palestine are suddenly labeled as terrorists. And Ronald Reagan once said that one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. So it is a very subjective matter when we talk about the right to resist and we talk about all of that. And the US has had a very big role in all of the what's happening in terms of the unconditional support and funding to the Zionist regime and the Zionist occupation. And it's not just the US, it is most Western countries which have made the Zionist occupation drunk with power, for lack of a better word, that they believe that they can do all of this and get away with it, that they can commit the war crimes and get away with it. And the biggest evidence of that is that the UN Security Resolution, Security Council resolution can be put to announce a ceasefire, and only the US has to veto that decision, and the ceasefire will not happen. And even if the resolution had passed, there have been countless resolutions that passed in support of Palestinian people, which the Zionist occupation does not follow. One of the top countries that does not follow the UN resolutions is the Zionist regime. So, and the US has constantly funded and sent weapons and sent countless dollars. I think it's over $270 billion that have been spent the Zionist regime ever since its existence to fund the occupation, to fund the genocide happening in Palestine. At the end of the day, it's taxpayer dollars. And the Western media has had a very big role in this by spreading the Zionist propaganda to most people, where they have most people, if you talk to them, they see the numbers wrongly. They think, like I was talking to a person here on campus. We have been having a lot of tabling events around campus to educate people about the matter and spread the actual facts. And we've been having a lot of mixed reviews. A lot of Zionists come and provoke us. A lot of people that are actually willing to learn. And you talk to people that think that when the hospital attack happened, they thought that the 500 people killed is a number of people totally killed in Gaza. Or they think that, oh, Hamas bombed its own hospital to cover up. You hear stuff that you do not know how people are thinking that. Just a lot of Zionist propaganda that's being shared. And most of it is coming from the US, and the leaders are believing it, and they're having the public to believe it. And I really believe that like the freedom of Palestine will never come without a mass mobilization of people worldwide, similar to what happened in South Africa to remove the apartheid regime. There has to be a mass mobilization of people. And as long as there's all this misinformation, all this Zionist propaganda, which is concentrated a lot in the US, there will never be the end goal of achieving freedom for Palestine. And when we talk for freedom of Palestine, and not just the US role in the entire occupation, but the people's role as people, if we stay silent. Yesterday in one of the protests, one of the speakers said something, the only thing standing between the people of Gaza and genocide is us. It is the people outside who are still talking about it. The only thing that makes the situation now different from the Nakba, which is the 1948 war that started the occupation and started the Zionist entity, is that now people are talking about it. People are fighting about it. There are people outside. There's the Palestinian diaspora. There's our allies. There's our supporters. There's everyone here that is willing to fight and speak on behalf of the Palestinian people. And it is everyone's job to talk, because there cannot be another forced dispossession of 700,000 Palestinians, or now they're talking about 2.2 million Palestinians in Gaza. There cannot be another genocide of wiping out Gaza and turning it into a parking lot, as they say. It is our job, all of us, to talk about it, to call representatives, to advocate, to go down to the street, to mass mobilization, throw a strike, throw a mass mobilization, throw a protest, anything. We all have a job in this to stop what's happening in Palestine, to stop the genocide, the ethnic cleansing, the apartheid that has been going on for far too long. And it's all of our parts. And there's a lot of people that think right now that, oh, we should just be calling for a ceasefire and the ceasefire and then think of what's happening. And I read this very good article where it says a ceasefire is not enough. We should definitely, the first thing we should be calling for is a ceasefire to stop the hourly worsening humanitarian situation happening in Palestine, the genocide, the war crimes, to stop all of that. But we must also look into a further of how can we change how can we change what happened, what led to what happened, how can we change the entire regime, how can we end the occupation. If as long as there's an occupation, what happened this week will still happen later. Ever since the start of the siege of Gaza, there has been the 2008, 2012, 2014, 2021, and now 2023. It will continue to happen. And for some reason, the Zionist entity thinks this time is different. I think this time they can wipe out Hamas and they will end the Palestinian resistance. Palestinians have been resisting for 75 years. And every time they tried to defeat the Palestinian resistance, there has been more and more stronger resistance, armed resistance, people resisting for their land. And this time is no different. And this time we have to all mobilize to support resistance in their efforts and not allow what's happening to happen and to continue to happen. And there's this Palestinian the political science Palestinian and poet called Tamim al-Barghouti. He says this is the beginning of the end. He says it's the beginning of the end of the occupation. In 2021, he released a video talking about how the freedom of Palestine is coming soon. And in 2023, he released a video. This is the beginning of the end. It's the beginning of the end of the occupation, he believes, because the narrative is changing slowly but surely. It's been a very strong uphill battle, but the narrative has been changing. And it is towards the favor of the Palestinian. The Palestinians are fed up and are resisting stronger than ever. Every Palestinian right now is willing to die standing on his land than to leave his land because they know I have family inside that we've been ever since the situation happened. We've been in contact of you guys want to come to Jordan, to come abroad, to be in a safer position. And all of them are the same response. No, we'd rather die standing on our homeland than leave. My grandfather left Palestine and was not able to return. 75 years later, and his descendants, we can still not return. The Palestinians are not going to. The only way this goes well for the Zionist entity if there is complete genocide to the Palestinian people. If they're all too many people in Gaza are killed, all the people in West Bank are killed, then they might succeed. But as long as there are people like us outside that are talking, that will not happen, and thus the resistance will never die. The Palestinian people will never die, and our freedom is going to come closer and closer every day. And it's there's this thing that they always say, these are my closing remarks, that it's always going to get harder before it gets better. And I believe this is the harder part. And I know times might look tough. But the people, it's something we learned about the people of Gaza and the people of Palestine, that their will is strong and they still believe and they're still fighting. We must not lose hope because we're very close to the liberation of Palestine. And I believe if we do the right steps coming forward, the liberation is very close.
So, I thought that I could just start by talking a little bit about international law, but with a caveat that I firmly believe that international legal regime is a tool of imperialism, and was sort of developed really to sort of maintain a global hierarchy, and particularly an economic hierarchy, but also racist hierarchy, right? But that said, there are sort of like many organizations, including the National Lawyers Guild and International Association of Democratic Lawyers, which is a global organization with many human rights defenders from the global South, including our member Raja Sarani in Gaza. We use international law as we critique it and think about kind of rebuilding international legal mechanisms, for one, that are actually supporting and honoring the will of the people. And so instead of going really in depth into detail, I'm just going to talk generally about it, and then when I'm done, I'm going to put in the chat a couple of documents, legal memos that I think are really helpful around these questions of whether or not Israel has a right to defend itself, and what is Palestine's right to resist under international law. And just to sort of say plainly, no, Israel does not have a right to defend itself under international law. The argument that they make is that they are sort of a victim of active aggression, but the aggression that they're talking about is originating from a place in which they control, right? They are the occupying power. Those are the occupied territories. And they have been in violation of the UN Charter from the very start. And every act of aggression, including the blockade itself, is a war of aggression against the Palestinian people. Palestinian people, on the other hand, have every right to self-defense. And international law from the very beginning sort of was founded on this principle of self-determination of peoples, and recognized, even in the Geneva Protocols, the existence of national liberation struggles. And so there's clear international legal resolutions that plainly state Palestinian right to resist, also by any means necessary, including armed struggle. And that language sort of began to be included sort of as kind of like the expression of what self-determination means in international law in the 60s, going into the 70s, well into the 80s, and explicitly named the Palestinian struggle as such a struggle that has that right, including South Africa and Zimbabwe and others. And I'm going to share sort of kind of like a survey of that language in the chat for you guys in a little bit, but I just kind of wanted to just kind of move into sort of what does that mean, right? That discourse, right? And the National Lawyers Guild had put out a statement in May of 2021, reiterating the right of Palestinians to resist by armed struggle, and sort of calling on people to boldly sort of defend that resistance and support that resistance, right? And we reiterated that again in a statement that we issued on October 8th or October 9th, right? And I think that we did receive some backlash from within some of our membership, right? But particularly with the younger generation, there has been overwhelming support for that position. And we see our chapters throughout the country, even in really conservative places like Mississippi and Georgia and Arizona, who are reiterating that same demand. The right to resist, this is a national liberation struggle. Our focus needs to be to support, to support the Palestinian struggle. I do think that there are other spaces, and I think that is the result of a lot of years of organizing has happened in an organization like the National Lawyers Guild, right? Because in fact, the National Lawyers Guild in 1948 supported the creation of the State of Israel and the shipment to all the Haganah, right? And that changed when our member Abdin Jabara organized the first delegation to Palestine in 1977, right? This is not come just to come overnight, let's say, right? And I'll talk about this a little bit in a few minutes, but I think that same work, sort of that same ability to sort of raise up that support for the resistance doesn't necessarily exist in other left spaces. And particularly, and this has just been my experience in the past week, that I'll talk about. But I wanted to also just say, and I'll also share this other document from the Center for Constitutional Rights, that Israel is guilty of genocide. They meet every single element within, sort of the article on genocide, and they have met it before, right? And the United States is complicit, and which is also a crime of genocide. The United States, shameful sort of way that they go about justifying their complicity in genocide is all this propaganda that we have seen in the news by Biden, by our mayors, by our governors, right? Targeting our community as security threats. And what has that has resulted in is a major backlash like we've never seen before, right? And so a lot of what we've been having to do, I mean, perhaps after 9/11, we saw a backlash of some kind. This is sort of a little bit different in the way that it's manifesting, right? But a lot of what we've been having to do for the past 3 weeks is really kind of mobilizing all of our legal forces to respond to the number of people who are being fired from their jobs, who are being visited by local police, or being visited by FBI, right? Who are being called by the FBI, who are being arrested in these demonstrations. Including, for example, someone who tweeted a tweet about the bombing of Adely Hospital, and then a right-wing media source described her tweet as a threat, and she was then investigated by local police and then visited by the FBI, and also is at risk of losing her job. Like, and we're getting 2 or 3 sort of like intakes of these similar cases on a daily basis. So the backlash is immense, and the backlash is real. So I just want to, I think that just getting back to this discussion of the right to resist, right? And Johnny kind of talked about like ceasefire, right? And I think, we're seeing this call for ceasefire in a lot of places, right? And it's not to say that like, that there aren't, that there isn't sort of a call for for the bombing in Gaza to dissipate so people will stop dying, right? But the thing is that with the ceasefire, we don't necessarily see that ceasefire demand coming from political leadership in Gaza, including like the unions, right? Because I'm a labor organizer, and that's one place where I have been focusing kind of a lot of my advocacy for Palestine over the years. And the messages that we've been getting from countless union leadership has really focused on ending the blockade, lifting the occupation, stopping U.S. complicit, shipment of arms into political and military support, because ceasefire without any change in the power dynamics is not going to save Gaza, right? It's only going to it might delay, right, their destruction. And so, it's really kind of important to sort of like qualify that, right? But I think that's sort of a safe place for supporters to go, right? In some ways, I recognize that, but I also want to say that like, it's a way to say we want to preserve Palestinian life without having to get too political, really, about what's going on, right? For various reasons, right? But I also want to say that, as somebody who's been organizing in unions, I'm sorry, for a very long time, and have been part of a lot of like union meetings at different periods of like escalation in Gaza and the West Bank, that I feel like that in May of 2021, there were bolder statements in support of Palestine, actually. And, we just had a meeting of about like 350, 360 trade union activists, and some people were on that call, right? By coalitions like, Labor Against War and Racism. A few days before that, there was a meeting of like National Writers Union, UE, and like Labor Notes, right? Which are spaces that I, engage in all the time. But I think, I frankly think that both of the statements that both of those entities came out with were very weak, right? And I think that they're facing the pressure of the propaganda, number one, and they're also not prepared, and they need to be pushed to be more prepared, to be more explicit in saying that this is a war of liberation, that this is what decolonization is going to be, and we need to support it, right? And I think there has to be more honest and explicit discussion about that in our organizing, right? And I think, I think that part of it, and this is something that, like, you know, we've talked a lot about within kind of like our Palestinian Arab circles, right? Part of it is this tendency to also, you know, really know how to support Palestinians when they're seen as victims, right? But we know we have to also know how to support Palestinians when we understand them to be the freedom fighters who they are, right? And perhaps that's something that, like, maybe in the 60s and the 70s was easier to do because we could see explicitly other liberation struggles like Algeria and South Africa, like, you know, and you know, sort of as examples, right? But so we have to kind of resurrect that narrative, those narratives and those understandings, right? And just to end on this, like, you know, as sort of a labor organizer as well as a lawyer, you know, I always kind of look to the example of the Arab auto workers who went on strike and demanded BDS in 1972 against UAW that they divest from Israeli bonds, right? And if you look closely, the group that organized that strike, which is the Arab Auto Workers Caucus, they published a flyer in 1974 and distributed at the UAW convention with all of these demands to divest from Israeli bonds. But they were very explicit in that their union organizing had to uplift the rights and self-determination of Palestinians and all people of the global South, right? There was an internationalism to it that I feel like is somehow is missing a little bit too much, not just in labor sectors, but others, right? So there's just a lot of work to do to change that narrative. And sometimes law can be helpful because people listen to law, but law exists in this liberal hegemony that we also have to critique.
I'm gonna start out by saying that what seems crystal clear to me at this hour is that Hamas and other armed resistance organizations are the only things standing between Palestinians and our complete annihilation. It's not international law, which, as far as I can see, in my lifetime, really has only served Western imperial interests. And it hasn't been any other mechanism. The world literally never looks our way until we fight back in ways that make Israelis feel insecure. So, in other words, when they have to taste an iota of what Israel does to Palestinians every day, only then are we invited to talk to the media, or is anything even talked about that relates to us. I mean, from the very beginning, you know, Palestinians went from one court to another, one country. We pleaded, we did everything we could to go home. And it wasn't until, you know, the 60s and 70s when Palestinians started hijacking planes to make a political point that our existence was even acknowledged. So I think it's important to, for starters, step away from this narrative of what makes a good victim, you know, what makes a good colonized people, what makes a colonized people worthy of liberation, right? Because that feels like what dominates the discourse. The critique seems to be on how we resist. And what's implicit in that is that, yes, that we're colonized, we're oppressed, we're brutalized, right? That's the implicit meaning in when people critique how we resist. But the conversation is not about Israelis. It tends to be always about Palestinians, and how, you know, how good we are or how bad. I want to say a few things also about the Israelis who were killed or taken prisoners of war, because that too is what is dominating Western discourse and media narratives. So I want to clarify a few things. Number one, Israel keeps pushing this popular lie that they're killing, they're forced to kill civilians. We're forcing them to kill us because Hamas uses civilians as human shields, even though there's literally zero evidence of that. Zero. But it's repeated as if it's just, gospel at this point. But there are human shields, and the real human shields are actually the Israeli colonizers that live in these Jewish-only settlements just outside the fence surrounding the largest concentration camp the world has ever seen, as well as around all major centers of Palestinian life in the West Bank and Jerusalem. Israel puts their own citizens in these places precisely as a frontline human shield against Palestinian aspirations for freedom and return to their homes. That's the function of these colony kibbutzes and Jewish-only towns. The second point about these folks is that all Israelis are required to serve in the military. So you'd be hard-pressed to find a single adult Israeli who is not part of that violent settler colonial military that has been erasing and shattering our lives. And the third thing is, despite Israel's hysterical lies about beheaded babies, there's actually zero evidence that Hamas harmed any child. In fact, what we've seen is exactly the opposite. And further, if Hamas had truly committed the horrid atrocities that they claimed, why would they feel the need to make up a story of 40 beheaded babies or any dead babies? And I think it's actually remarkable that Hamas conducted themselves with the level of humanity that they did, considering the fact that they have, every single one of those fighters has probably never been out of that enclave, ever. They have all lived lives we can't even imagine. Caged, bombarded, bombed, orphaned. A lot of us who do this work are always attacked as anti-Semitic for pointing out the inordinate influence and even control that Zionists exert on Western media. But I think that most reasonable people now can see the truth in our words. If any journalist repeated the lies that they did without an iota of evidence in any other context, they'd be fired with the quickness. But it wasn't just one or two journalists. It was literally whole networks, all of them, all over the Western Hemisphere, repeating these lies, even after they were verified lies. So another thing I want to mention is, we keep talking about the horrific death toll, 4,100. It just, one starts to lose count. But in some ways, I think those 4,100 martyred are starting to feel like the lucky ones who don't have to face this life that Israel has created in Gaza now. The trauma is unfathomable. The loss is just beyond comprehension. The homes and the memories, the photos, the clothes, the dreams, the plans that these already deprived and violated people had. And Israel is committing genocide in full view of the world, full view. And far from condemnation, we're seeing a world actually cheering it on. So, you know, you'd be hard pressed at this hour to find any Palestinian who does not support armed resistance. And we have every right, and I don't mean legal right, but moral right to resist in any way. And in fact, it is our moral duty to resist in any way. This is an existential fight for Palestinians. And we have been witnessing our own erasure for 75 years, and still in good faith and with complete humanity, we keep hoping, we celebrate these little resolutions and this kind little one, like these little crumbs that a politician will throw our way every once in a while, and BDS, and the BDS wins, and at the end of the day, Gaza's still a concentration camp. The West Bank is still dwindling day by day. What little remains to us of Palestine is being taken inch by inch, and nothing is changed. So I want to be really clear that I support, and I would give everything I have at this hour to the resistance, the armed resistance, to be clear. In terms of how we got here, I think, as shocking as it is, we shouldn't be surprised at what Israel's doing. For years, they have escalated incrementally, almost to see, what they can get away with. Each bombing campaign in Gaza is more intense than the previous one. Each storming of Al-Aqsa is more bold than the one before. Each settler attack is more vicious than the one before. And each time they enjoy complete impunity, and not just impunity, but silence, complete silence in the world, because our lives don't really matter. It's only when Israeli lives are threatened that that any of this becomes news. And Israel also, with each new assault, they don't just get more violent and brutal, but they get savvier in how they manipulate the media and manipulate the narrative. They're even paying influencers apparently $1,000 for each video that they post in support of Israel, or in condemnation of Hamas. I mean, think how corrupt and desperate they must be to do that. And another lesson I think they've learned is to try and do something about those of us in the diaspora, especially in the West, who start to organize in support of our families back home, which is why we're seeing all of these attacks on us here, which is why so many people are losing their jobs, and there's this, which is why a little literature festival brought the full weight of this Zionist World Wide Web down to bear on us. This is not, this is so far from a reaction or response. I mean, this has to be premeditated. This was completely planned. This had been in the works. They have, 20, 30, even 40 years ago, they've been talking in my life. They're talking about, another Nakba 2.0. They've been salivating at this. They've been planning for it. They've been, revising strategies on how to get to this point. Which, sometimes, in many ways, I believe maybe they even knew about what was going to happen on October 7th, and they let it. They wanted it. They wanted this excuse. They wanted a reason to go in and grab more of Palestine. And you know, apparently Israel had back during the days of Hosni Mubarak had floated the idea or tried to get Hosni Mubarak to take Palestinians from Gaza into the Sinai. You know, like, so they've been wanting to take Gaza for a long time, and now apparently on social and on their social media platforms and their chat groups, they're sharing these images of you know, new real estate, what they're going to do with the coastal real estate in Gaza. So this is the plan. This is a plan that has been in the works for a long time. And once they're done with Gaza, I think they want to move on to the West Bank. From the West Bank, I believe they'll start moving to Jordan and Lebanon. I mean, that guy Smoltrich, you know, was months ago was in an interview saying, look, it's the Torah tells us, I'm just going by the Torah. You know, Damascus is ours. We will keep going. I mean, they said this is like, it's right there. So, you know, Jordan's next, Syria's next. So you know, I don't know what the answer is. I wish there was a way for, you know, to just storm the borders and just go be in Gaza. I mean, you know, this sounds absurd, but I'm just going to admit it. I have these fantasies of just going, trying to get to Gaza, and all of us just being there. Just, okay, you know what? You want to do a ground invasion of Gaza? Just come to, you're just going to have to be over all of our dead bodies. And you know, and it's clear to me that that's our only power. It's our bodies, it's the masses of people, and that's not a small power. You know, the street is not a small power. I feel like I've overstayed my my time, but and I'm not good at wrapping things up, but so maybe I should just stop abruptly. But I want to just, maybe I'll end with this. I read this really great quote by somebody in Gaza who said, I used to think that Israel controlled Gaza, but now I know that Israel controls everywhere but Gaza, every country but Gaza. Yeah. Thanks.
All right. Thank you, Susie. You know, you were just making me think about during the 1930s, right? We had these brigades that went all across from all over the world that went to Spain and to fight fascism. And I wondered if we can get those brigades going again. It almost feels like that's what we need. All right, I have a couple of really excellent questions waiting for folks, waiting for the speakers in the chat. And I want to encourage people, especially now that they've heard all three speakers, if you've got questions, responses, please put them in the chat and we'll relay them. I'm going to start with one question of my own. You know, this morning on Facebook, I posted a quote from James Baldwin, who's one of my favorites and my heroes. And he said, you know, Israel wasn't just created to save the Jews. It was created in the interest of Western capitalist countries, right? France and England and the United States all supported the creation of Israel because they all wanted a place to like protect their oil interests in the Middle East. That's one of the reasons that Israel's there, right? To kind of be a watchdog for Western interests. And, you know, the $3 billion the United States gives to Israel this year comes back to it as a kind of investment. And, you know, one of the things we've talked about in Puntorojo is that all these Arab states that have abandoned the Palestinians, they're just so capitalistic. They just want to trade with Israel now, right? So I guess my question is, how do we get rid of the occupation? How do we throw Israel out of there without getting rid of capitalism itself? Can that be done? Because, like Suzanne, you're so right. International law, right, also protects capital in all kinds of ways that we don't accept, but you actually have to navigate. So I'm wondering if any of you have thoughts on the relationship between all of the bloodshed that we're seeing now, and the larger, Marx said capitalism comes into the world dripping blood from hand to foot. And so I'm wondering if you could talk about that relationship a little bit as you see it. Yeah.
We say it always, and it's the freedom of Palestine will never come for the freedom of the entire Arab world and the entire Arab minds. And as long as there are dictatorships in the Arab world, as long as there are Western influence in the Arab world, the greater region and the world in general, want to call it capitalism, call it dictatorship. As long as there's that influence, the freedom of Palestine will never come. Yesterday in our rally, uh, there was a professor who was speaking, and they said that it is not us who will free Palestine, but it is Palestine who will free us. It is, I believe that the Palestinian struggle is, as long as there is that, what you mentioned, all that motives in Palestine and the reasons for people to support the occupation for their own benefits, the freedom of Palestine will never be truly achieved. And it is the struggle for the Palestinian liberation is a struggle against all oppression, not just oppression against Palestinian. It is something we have in our SJP constitution. It is let it be known that this chapter not only fights against oppression in Palestine, but for all sorts of oppression. Uh, and that's why we see a lot of, for example, the Black Lives Matter movement is very supportive. All people who are oppressed are very supportive of the Palestinian struggle and the Palestinian liberation movement because we're all very connected. And as long as there is those intentions, and we see it all those Arab countries, dictatorships that will just want for their own personal gain, not for the gain of the people, want to normalize the relationships with the occupation for economic gain. It is very sad to see, but something that has made me very happy in this past escalation is that it is still proof that the Arab people have not given up on Palestine, even if the governments have given up on Palestine. The Arab people are still fighting. We are seeing protests in every Arab country with millions in attendance. People are speaking, the people are vocal, the people are trying. Just the other day, Susan was talking how she wants to just go to the borders. Tens of thousands of Jordanians tried to cross the border to cross into Palestine, and it was the Jordanian government that was throwing tear gas and imprisoning people and sending them back and closing the streets for them not to cross. The people will liberate, and as I said, the freedom of Palestine will not come just as the freedom of Palestine, but the freedom of the entire world. Because Palestine, it is a struggle, and we will free all our minds from this colonial and disgusting mindset that we've been ingrained in us.
Sure. Bill, can you repeat the question for me, please?
How do you see the relationship between Israel's occupation of Palestine and brutalization of Palestinians and the workings of global capitalism?
So, thank you for repeating that for old lady who can't remember one thing from 1 second to the next. In a lot of ways, Israel is kind of the linchpin in this Western world order that sort of ties their the what they feel was the glory of their colonial past to the modern world. And it is kind of, I mean, Israel is a European settler colony that's frankly genocidal, and it's the West's last hurrah in this way. But Israel in its own right is it is a symbol or an enterprise of this sort of capitalist global domination and purveyor of supremacist ideologies. A lot of people don't know, people like sort of look at Israel's misdeeds as being kind of limited to the brutalization of Palestinians. But in fact, Israel is literally the greatest exporter of death machines and military wares per capita that the world has ever known. Per capita, Israel exports more military wear than the United States, China, and Russia combined. And this is not even the full picture. This is just what is known. So there's this organization called SIPRI that basically just monitors and keeps an audit of all arms transfers all over the world, what they are, where they go, etc. And not all countries report this, of course, and Israel is one of the countries that do not report that. But the data SIPRI has on Israel is based on information they've collected from recipient countries, from declassified documents, from special investigations, etc. So the real picture is much larger. And a lot of these weapons, weapon sales, go to places and countries where arms embargoes are. So that's kind of their specialty in a way. They sell to places and militias and countries that the rest of the world will not sell to because of various embargoes. For example, during the genocide in Rwanda, Israeli arms dealers were selling weapons to them when when the whole world knew what was happening. The same thing in during the genocide in Bosnia. Israel was selling and training Serbs, and when the world knew there was a genocide taking place, and we know this from the war crimes tribunals and the diaries of war criminals, Ratko Mladic and others. They were selling, and I think continue to sell weapons to Burma when genocide was being committed against the Rohingyas. You can get nearly every instance of genocide or mass oppression or mass killing. Israel has its fingers in there, and they're selling weapons. And there's a lot of, we don't have time, and this isn't the forum for it, but there's a lot of reasons and mechanisms why this happens, and how they have been able to sort of spread out into all the world. And in part, it's because, Israel is composed of people who belong to other cultures. And so they have a natural in with various countries all around the world, because they're from those places. But Israel is and then of course it's doing its thing throughout Africa, in just massive extraction, whether historically diamonds or the whole blood diamond concept is Israel's knee deep in all of the mechanisms of the blood diamonds, because it's one of the main centers of in the diamond industry anyway. So I think whether this Zionist settler colonial apartheid state succeeds or not will reverberate all over the planet. It is not a local issue. It is not even just a regional issue. It is literally a global issue. It is a fight between genocidal imperial supremacist capitalist ideologies and universal human dignity, and concepts of life, you know, of just of a life-giving, nurturing planet and disposition of society versus this capitalistic, predatory, colonial disposition. So, and Israel and Palestine are at the heart of it all.
Thanks, Susie. Thanks. Suzanne, you want?
Yeah. So yeah, you know, I think that it can't be like overstated how much capitalism and global capitalism is connected to the occupation of Palestine, right? I think going back to like even like the Truman and Roosevelt administrations, when they still hadn't been as firmly grounded in supporting Israel yet, but their top advisors were basically saying to them that control of the Middle East is control of the world, but I think that from the perspective of the Palestinian struggle, I think it's always also been an economic justice issue, right? The first revolt was of the peasant revolt in the 30s, right? And then like worker struggles and strikes always at the center. And I think always the consciousness that like Palestinians are occupied, right? Because and the U.S. is and the U.S. and other allies of the U.S. are staunchly supporting that occupation and that genocide and ethnic cleansing because they want to continue to control the region, right? And they know why the region is important, right? It's oil, but it's also access to the Asia Pacific, like and trade and so on, and I think that there's different levels of that understanding, kind of like within kind of like the discourse in Palestinian struggle, but I think that like particularly with the growth of the idea of like the one secular state like South Africa, I think and I don't know, I'm not saying that that's the discourse now, but it had been sort of for a long time, right? Because now I just don't even know if that's possible. I think the settlers have to go, but like the one secular state model of South Africa, I think inherently within it also had sort of an was conscious of the role of capitalism, and particularly when thinking about the Palestinian elite, particularly manifested in the PA and how that they kind of have protected their own interests and really become collaborators of the occupation. Like these are critiques that are there, right? Now, spreading into the rest of the region, I think, like Johnny said, the people are out in the streets in support of Palestine and themselves kind of living under very repressive regimes and that are repressive for the because for the same reasons, our repressive, their repression is very much also connected to the U.S. support for those regimes as well, right? Like Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and I remember seeing a sign during the uprisings in Egypt that said that the liberation of Jerusalem begins with the liberation of Tahrir, right? So that this idea that that there has to be like a multifaceted struggle in the region, right? For the kind of liberation that Palestine and others need, and that's why for example, the counter-revolution in Egypt was so harsh, right? And still is, but it was so important to support that struggle because they were the ones, it was the Egyptian youth who in 2012 drove those buses in past Rafah into Gaza, right? So their ability to stay out of jail to not be killed by their own regime left them able to also be this kind of like front for Palestine as well. Like, you know, so it's all very interconnected. And I think, as Susan said too, it even goes farther than the region, right? And like, including like their support for South Africa, their support for, you know, Pinochet, and, you know, their training of our police forces, like including like, you know, in Atlanta where Cop City is being, you know, the exporter of repression. But also I think that like, I don't know, you know, I feel like the US is really trying to, as Susan said, Israel's kind of a linchpin, right? US is really trying to maintain its hold on its empire. Things are really shit for them right now, like between Ukraine and this movement to a more kind of multipolar world where like states coming together to sort of like, and I'm not going to, you know, regardless of what we think that is, it is a direct kind of like opposition to US hegemony, right? And Biden is almost desperate in his like need to sort of like really just just give everything to Israel right now. It's disgusting, you know. It's disgusting. And if anybody tells me that I need to vote for Biden over Trump, I'm gonna punch them in the face. Like I promise anyone that, like, or I might even cut them, honestly, to tell you the truth, right? Because I can't, like, and this is the big question of what the hell is this liberal left like community going to say about the role that the Democratic Party has played in this, right? Where is the accountability for those who say that they're for human rights? Like that's going to be a really, really big question, I think, going down the line.
Okay, those are fabulous answers. Thank all of you. I just posted in the chat a link to a story about a giant protest in Tahrir Square yesterday for Palestine, which is important because there's so much repression from the state down and repressing exactly this kind of protest. And I believe you're right. This liberation question for Palestine is regional, and people in Egypt know it. Ordinary people know it. Okay, I've got 7 really amazing questions in the chat, and I'm going to kind of work through them now. And please keep posting them if you'd like. Because there's so many, I'm going to ask the speakers if they could to maybe keep their comments to a couple of minutes so we can try to work through as many as possible. The first question is, how is the narrative around Palestine changing right now? The US continues to tell Israel to bomb and supplies them with weapons. Most of the European leaders continue to support Israel. Genocide is being condoned. Is the narrative changing? Is it not changing? How do you see that? And I guess this is a question that raises the question of the role of protest in this moment too. Yeah, thoughts on that one.
If I can mention, being in the university campus, for example, you see on a daily basis, with every event we do, with every protest we do, with every tabling, with everything we do, the narrative is slowly changing. And it is as if people are opening their eyes to what is happening and realizing, and it's not a very fast process. These are people who have been, ever since they were birthed, being fed Zionist propaganda. And it's a very slow movement. But I look at it 20 years ago, if we called the Zionist regime an apartheid regime, or if we said all of these words, we would have immediately called anti-Semitic. Now you have Amnesty International, Bet Salem, Israel's largest human rights organization, calling it an apartheid regime, calling it occupation, calling it genocide. I think in the terminology we're using, the narrative is changing. And all of that, the narrative changing, it's not changing fast enough or as much as we need it, especially with the governmental powers. But I think in terms of people, in terms of the youth, it has been changing drastically and very quickly. And it's something you can see, especially the last 2 weeks, especially in campus. You can see with the interview that are showing up people who are not related to the issue, not Palestinian, not Arab, not related at all. Just people who are coming to support. I think the narrative is changing in a very good way, not as fast as we need it, but it's definitely changing.
Thanks, John. I'll just add, if you look at these polls, and they're not very scientific, but supposedly like half of Americans don't really want to send more weapons to Israel right now, which is pretty shocking to me, given how much garbage they're being fed. And I don't know if it's true. Okay. Suzanne or Susie, you want to talk about this changing narrative? Do you see Do you see shifts going on?
I mean, I agree for sure. There's, I mean, even in, in my lifetime, even just saying Palestine or Palestinian, either people thought, you said Pakistan or they immediately conjured terrorists. And I mean, I remember so many just racist kind of, jokes when I was younger, people saying, oh, you don't have a bomb strapped to your belly or anything, so, um, and it is, Palestine is solidly a leftist issue now. And at least on the left, you get your bona fides on the left by being anti-Zionist. So that is a major shift. It used to be even left groups were queasy about, speaking up for Palestinians. But and all of that, is a testament to the work, to the incremental work, generational work that we've been doing here. But I think we have neglected to talk to in sort of directing our conversation so much to the West, to English speaking people. We've neglected our own young people and also the global South. Our conversation with the world tends to be very Anglocentric or Eurocentric. And I've learned that actually there are a lot of, and like a shocking number in the Arab world who don't even know the history and don't even know the specifics. A lot of Palestinians even. And I kind of learned this really from readers who would write to me and say, I never really understood this, or I never understood until I read this. And so, but that's just in the Arab world. But we have friends in the global South who that we don't need to preface anything for. We don't need, I mean, people in the global South can look at our condition and intuitively understand. But we've kind of neglected a conversation with them. We've neglected doing the work there because we make certain assumptions about what they know and don't know. And in the meantime, Israel has been going into various African countries, for example, doing these water treatment things as if it's charitable, and basically spreading pro-Zionist propaganda throughout. And it has, and we're seeing a waning of support from nations who were always, solidly on our side. And these are all former colonies who waged their own liberation struggles in through guerrilla warfare and these leftist communist liberation movements that worked and trained alongside the PLO, and now they're kind of going in another direction. I mean, one of the biggest examples, and this is not exactly along what I'm talking about, is India. I mean, it's just shocking to see this pro-Israel stand from in just a couple of generations out, removed from Nehru. So yeah, so it's things are shifting in one way in some places and shifting in another way in other places, is the bottom line.
Thanks, Suzanne. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Johnny and Susan, and particularly what Susan said about the left and how, Palestine, our demands around Palestine were not welcome for a long time in these left spaces, anti-war spaces. So that has changed. I think that there still has to be more narrative shift, particularly around like, support for resistance. And I think we also have to be like pointing out that like, okay, who is supporting Israel right now? It is a ruling elite, like, And it's also fascism. You know what I mean? And like, so just clearly, like, let people sort of look at what, like, think about like what that means, yeah, I totally agree with Susan about the conversations with the global South. I run a like binational workers organization of mainly migrant workers, like from the Caribbean and Central America, and like the solidarity is there. They're colonized people themselves, right? And like they don't need a teach-in to say that they're in solidarity with the Palestinians, but they have less power in their positions as farm workers or like poultry workers, for example, right? And yeah, I when the uprisings began in the Arab world, I was actually in India working at the time, right? And I kind of noticed exactly that pattern that Susan was talking about, that like, there was Occupy, there was Egypt, there was Tunis, and there was like this global conversation that was going on. There was Chile, but there's a lot of spaces in the global South that were not necessarily brought into that. Like, and I was in India in 2014 when we had a protest in front of the Israeli embassy. And, the solidarity is there. And we have, we have a lot of opportunity to unite with those who are fighting Modi, right? Who's a huge ally of Israel and the Junta Tava, and they're part of this Zionist backlash in the US, right? We haven't really put enough work into that. And similarly, like I attended a law conference in Togo in West Africa, where they had been fighting against the Israeli kind of economic cooperation meeting there, and then uplifted Palestinian solidarity at the end of their conference. And I don't think that most of our youth would even know where Togo was, honestly. So yeah, I really appreciated that comment, Susan.
Thank you all for being so global in your responses. It really helps, I think, frame the challenges right now. This is, I think, a really interesting question from Kirsten. I want to go back to what Susan said about the lack of condemnation of the genocide in Palestine, as well as the labeling of the criticism of the genocide as anti-Semitic. This occupation is backed by some of the largest Western military powers for what's essentially imperialist endeavors. It got me thinking about characteristic white supremacist culture, specifically the right to comfort, where those with substantial power have the right to emotional and psychological comfort, regardless of what's at stake. I think the labeling of the condemnation of the genocide as anti-Semitic plays into this. And my question is, where do we acknowledge the prevalence of white supremacist influence in this occupation, and to what extent? Should we go in the same order, Johnny, and then Susie and Suzanne?
I think like something we always say here is that they use the anti-Semitic label as a shield to protect themselves. Whenever we say anything about the Zionist state, they always raise up, oh, but you're being anti-Semitic. Oh, whatever you say, like there's this thing, like when we chant from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. We call for we call for our freedom of Palestinians, and they label it as a genocidal call of, oh, we want to throw all of the Jewish people into the sea, and like they call us anti-Semitic. When we call for our freedom, they call us anti-Semitic. Whatever we say, they call it anti-Semitic, and it is. I think it's a bit overdone at this point, how they always like the claim for like they always use the word anti-Semitic as to shield themselves from accountability, as to divert the actual allegations put against them. They shield themselves from it by labeling it us and flipping it around to us. And
You want to comment, Susan, or?
Yeah, sure. Wasn't sure if Johnny
Yeah.
had more. So, Israel is Zionism is a form of white supremacy. I mean, it's but the thing about their white supremacy, which is increasingly visible in the United States as well, is that it is now multiracial. You know, we were it's, you know, when you think of white supremacy beyond race, this makes sense. Like, for example, we had this a city council meeting a couple of days ago where Philadelphia City Council was meeting. Now, all the councilmen, like all the councilmen and women, like the majority of them are Black. Philadelphia is a solidly Black city. And all of them had voted for or had co-sponsored this resolution, basically to condemn Hamas, show solidarity with Israel, yada, yada. And, you know, I got up to testify, and that was, you know, that was part of my contribution, which is that, you know, the only thing this is proving to me is that white supremacy has become multiracial. To Johnny's point, the weaponization of anti-Semitism has been so effective, especially the conflation of criticism of Israel and anti-Semitism, and that is really what has made the attack on the festival, and of course on all Palestinians, but you know, the attack on the festival is so recent for me, the Palestine Rights Festival, in that they, you know, we had all of the administration at Penn just repudiating the festival. There's still statements and letters coming out. Everybody wants all these donors. They pulled over 150 million. Now it's escalated, I think, to $200 million in donations from Penn, because they, you know, because they hosted the Palestine Rights Festival there. And the president and various trustees and whatnot have issued statements talking about the reprehensible speakers and et cetera, but then when you look at what's so reprehensible about them, and you look at the quotes that are being pulled out, every single one of them is about Israel. And this idea that we, as a colonized people who have been brutalized and exiled and dispossessed and robbed and had our hearts carved out by this state, the idea that we need to speak softly and gently and kindly and in consideration of their feelings is offensive. And it's taken for granted by all of these, you know, smart people, these university presidents, and it's, you know, I really don't know sometimes if these people are just corrupt or if they're just stupid. I don't really, it's one or the other, really. Either they're just, they know the difference and they understand, and they're just, you know, they're just, you know, worried about their jobs and the bottom line and their own self-interest, or they really don't get it. They think that we shouldn't criticize Israel, or we shouldn't speak in harsh terms about this horrible colony. So, but either way, you know, Zionists have been successful in leveraging white guilt and European guilt over what they did to their own Jewish citizenry.
Thank you, Susan. Suzanne?
I mean, mean, yeah, I mean, as was stated, Zionism is, kind of founded on this idea of like a superiority of like particularly white Jewish, European Jewish, class, or, and it's become so institutionalized, right? So that sometimes it's like, it's horrible people, sometimes it's stupid people, sometimes it's people that just oblivious that they're sort of like reproducing this. I mean, when I got an email, the first kind of email I got from somebody after we wrote our NLG statement, like quoted Golda Meir, that like there'll be peace in the Middle East when Arab mothers stop raising their children to hate, kind of thing. And this is but this has become acceptable language over the years. I mean, like anti-Arab racism, Islamophobia has really kind of become an acceptable thing, like, in not just in sort of fascist spaces, but also in liberal spaces as well, and it's needed to be, not just because of the occupation of Palestine, but the war in Iraq and the war in Afghanistan, and like, and so, it's there, and it just kind of like shows itself everywhere, including in the language that we're hearing today about, Palestinians being animals. And and so they're not like, so we don't consider them to have rights as people, but they're like animals who were sort of like caging and taking care of, so yeah, I mean, there's a lot that can be said about this, but maybe I'll just leave it there right now.
Thank you all. It just, as you were talking about the festival being attacked, this was a writing festival. These were poets and novelists who were being described as terrorists. And since, in the past week, a Palestinian film festival was canceled in Boston. Viet Nguyen, who's a major Pulitzer Prize winning writer who supported Palestinians, has been canceled in New York. Like, who else could you do this to? I wonder. I feel like Palestinians play a special role in holding white supremacy in place as a group that they can always be canceled, like at every level. Do you know what I mean? Okay, the next question is also an interesting one. Can any of you give a comparison to the atmosphere of propaganda post 9/11 in the US that led to 2 wars with no positive outcome and the spread of even more horrible death and destruction? The message in the US was, you're either with us or you're with the terrorists, and I see very strong parallels. I'll just add to this question, that right away, as soon as October 7th happened, Israel said, this is our 9/11. So how do folks think about that? What does that reveal about the challenges we have and the political discourse that we're involved with? 9/11, as it were. Johnny, you want to go first?
So I was not alive in 9/11, but hearing from people who were alive in 9/11, the hatred that we feel, like as a chapter at Purdue, we've gotten death threats, we've gotten, oh, you guys murdered children, you guys deserve to die, and talking to people who were alive in 9/11, it is the same thing. There's a rise in Islamophobia, there's a rise in Arab racism, Palestinian racism, and it all accumulated. For example, the child who was killed with the Al-Fayoumi in Chicago or Illinois, sorry, who was brutally murdered by his landlord because, oh, you're Palestinian, you deserve to die, because he's been fed this Zionist propaganda by sadly people in the US government, such as Biden, who spread these rumors and false claims of beheading of 40 children, of all of these stuff. It's a dehumanization tactic. Like the Israeli occupation forces, they call it, oh, we're battling human animals. People do not care what's happening in Palestine because they do not see Palestinians as humans. They see them as less than humans. It has been a tactic. It was used in Iraq to justify the Iraq wars, used in Afghanistan, used in all of this. It's a dehumanization tactic. And it's fueled by all the propaganda we see in the media, by all of this. And I think they're very similar, even though I was not alive back then, but you hear when people were alive, it's the same thing. We have people from our communities here on campus who are afraid to leave their dorm rooms or their houses because the way people are looking at us, they do not see us as humans. They see us as people, oh, that we behead children, that we rape women, all these false rumors that are being spurred up in the media. It's a dehumanization agenda that has been around for a long while. And it is very sad that as Palestinians, we have to fight the occupation and constantly prove our humanity to people, constantly prove that we are human just like you, that we deserve to live just like you, that we have, for example, like bringing it back to the right to resist. The right to resist is a basic human right. It is by international law, about it's a human right, and we constantly have to defend that we deserve this human right just like any other people. It is very sad that as Palestinians we must constantly prove our humanity as the Western media and all of the Zionist agenda is dehumanizing us to support this. And bringing it back to the 9/11, it is when they call it, oh, this is the 9/11. There's this quote. I do not like to compare massacres, compare what happens, but there's this thing that always circulates: "Dear USA, your 9/11s are 24/7." What we face is what Palestinians face every day is horrible. And I think Billy mentioned it in the start, what was Susan maybe, that the first time that the settlers in occupied Palestine feel what Palestinians feel on an everyday basis, the entire world erupts. What happened in October 7 in occupied Palestine is what happened in Gaza every day, what happens in the West Bank is every day, and was happening for the past 75 years. So yes, I agree with the point that the narrative being said and how they're trying to frame it as a 9/11 to justify their actions, the propaganda and hate that's being spread, it is very true.
Thank you, Johnny. Susie?
I had to first get over the shock that there are adults now who weren't alive during 9/11. Did you feel that too, Bill? Yeah, so I wrote about that when Israel immediately said this is our 9/11 moment, which kind of added to my sense that this was premeditated. And yeah, I mean, given what a 9/11 moment means for our region, for Arabs in particular, it's a terrifying thought. And it does make me think that I kind of think like Israel looked at that and started salivating at the possibilities, like what the United States was able to accomplish with, one like major event. And I think it was always, it just stayed in the back of their minds. Like, when are we going to get our chance? And I really think that, I believe this is how they think. And I believe that they immediately were thinking, okay, who can we bomb? How much can we get away with? How far can we ride this wave? And I think right now, because of the mass protests against them, I think they're almost feeling a little victimized that they're not getting the same sympathy. You know what I mean? Like it's anyway. But I do think Israel kind of dreams and imagines destroying Iran and continuing to expand, continuing to grab land and grab resources. I mean, they have already siphoned the majority of the water resources in that area away from Lebanon, from Syria and Jordan, and certainly Palestinians. And they, as soon as Iraq was attacked and devastated, one of the first things they started working on and wanted to work on with the US administration, you guys might not remember this, and it didn't get a whole lot of coverage, but they immediately wanted to reopen an old pipeline that ran from Basra to I want to say I think it was from Basra to Haifa. And they also were trying to write into the constitution of Iraq, on the new, imperial constitution, that clauses that would require reparations, state reparations for Iraqi Jews who left Iraq. And so they're always scheming to take more from the surrounding area. And I think they're trying to do that here, but I think their plans are getting foiled by Hamas and by the people who are remaining steadfast in Gaza, and by people around the world who are just starting to rise up a little. Yeah. And if it wasn't for Hamas, they would have rolled their tanks in way earlier, and the whole northern parts would be gone. But they're scared, apparently. And they have tried to roll the tanks in for a ground invasion, and the reports we're seeing from the ground is that their little first attempt that was immediately repelled by Hamas. So they're not prepared. Their army cannot confront actual fighters on the ground. I mean, we see Palestinian kids saying, we're going to stay. I mean, they speak passionately about defending their land. And that's how indigenous people speak. But colonizers, first thing they do is run to their home countries, which is also what we're seeing Israelis do. So I do want to kind of end this on a hopeful note, because I am hopeful. And I think, we're mired in the pain and the grief of the horrors we're witnessing. But I think this is the beginning of their end. Yeah. This kind of extreme immorality, extreme base behavior, extreme racism, and just wanton violence is just, at a minimum, it's unsustainable.
Thank you, Susan. Yeah, go ahead, Suzanne.
Yeah. Yeah, so I was alive, an adult at 9/11, and I was working as an organizer in our community in New York and Chicago. And I mean, it does feel similar, but there are some differences, actually, right? And I think, but I also remember, I was younger, but I also remember the first Gulf War as well, and that kind of like, and there had things that had happening in the region before that as well, right? And so there was always like this feeling of like otherness, because you were part of this community that was at war with the United States on some level. Like, even like we even got like attacked, my family, like a hate crime against us because people thought we were Iranian at some point, and so on. So just kind of like conscious that we were kind of like part of that. And then I think the first Gulf War, the way that it felt like to a lot of people was like this kind of like unknown, like first major war, other than the occupation of Palestine in the region, right? And what was going to come out of that, and there was some backlash. There certainly was, right, and it manifested in a lot of ways. But it was really more about like, are you a patriot or are you not, kind of thing, right? And then with 9/11, the backlash was immense. It manifested in many different ways, like the hate crimes on our families and communities, like, the special registration, the disappearances, the detention. And this time around, like, we are getting the FBI visits. We are kind of getting like police investigations. People are firing from their jobs. There are hate crimes. like that, baby boy from Illinois. And but I think there are certain things we saw at 9/11 that not necessarily happening now. There are more like sort of like customs and ICE related sort of detentions at the border and so on, but not at the level that we saw at 9/11, right? But what's different, and I think this speaks to sort of what Susan was saying, was that, and first of all, Israel's use of that term 9/11, I don't think it has their 9/11. I don't think it has the same effect now that it like would have had like maybe 10, 15 years ago. Because I think people have seen through the veil of that and the veil of using the word terrorism, which in our practice, like in the NLG, like we try to never use it. Like, you know what I mean? Like when there was an attack on the Cuban embassy like last month, and they posted that there was a terrorist attack against the Cubans, we're just like, we never reproduce that term because it always just comes back against us, as we're seeing with domestic terrorism charges in Atlanta and so on. So it's really about kind of like delegitimizing that language, but what I would say is really fundamentally different now is that, just as Susan was saying, when this began, it was simultaneously like a feeling of dread and a feeling of joy, right? I don't know if everybody would really understand that, but like my niece called me, she's in Jordan when this all started to happen, but like not joy, maybe joy is not the right word, but like this is like this was sort of a historic moment of the resistance, kind of like sort of and resistance is not just Hamas, it's the Palestinian resistance overall that is making an important historical move, right? That in a lot of ways that we've been waiting for, and like Susan said, probably Israel was waiting for it too, right? Because they know that they can use these moments to continue to get away with more and more and more, and they think that this is the moment to do that even more, but I feel like that's one kind of like fundamental, and because I was like, 9/11, the towers, we still don't know what the hell that was. I'm not pretending that we do, but we know firmly what this is, you know what I mean? And we'll stand firmly in saying that, you can't tell us that our support for Hamas and for the other factions and for the resistance is anything but just in this case. So that's a fundamental difference.
Thank you. We're getting pretty close to end of time. I want to give each of the speakers maybe a minute to make a kind of closing statement, and maybe send us out with some optimism and maybe a last thought on where we should be putting some of our organizing and political work, if you could, in brief, and then I'm going to kind of bring it back to myself for some closing comments and wrap up. And Johnny, before you start yours, somebody asked if you could you repeat who it was who said, "We will not free Palestine, Palestine will free us"? I don't know if that was you or somebody else.
It was Dr. Titi. She's a professor here at Purdue. She said that it was a very good speech. I wish I could repeat the speech. She should do it once other than me. But she's going to be giving a talk on campus this Tuesday, hopefully. The date has not been set yet, but she's going to give a talk all about the Palestinian issue. She's an amazing professor, and we thank her. And do you want me to go off my closing remarks?
Yeah, please.
I think one thing, I said it before, I'll say it again, it's going to get harder before it gets easier. But I really believe that we're at a tipping point in the Palestinian struggle. And I really feel that this time is different. I really feel that this time, we're getting closer to the liberation of Palestine. It is going to get hard. The deaths will continue to rise, and it's very sad to see what is happening. It's very sad to see the death and destruction. But I think, as a Palestinian, I think every Palestinian agrees with me. I think every Palestinian is willing to die now, knowing that his children are going to be able to live in a free Palestine. I think we're all willing to see that and do that. And at the end of the day, I think our job here as job, as people abroad, as the diaspora, as people's allies, supporters, all of that, is to continue to raise awareness, to continue to talk about Palestine, to continue to pressure the governments. I think it's going to need a lot of mass mobilization, a lot of people from different backgrounds, different people, to all go down to the streets. Let's protest, let's march, let's do that, let's talk about Palestine, let's continue educating about Palestine, let's show, just showing the people of Palestine that we support them, that they have someone abroad helping them. It really means a lot. The videos of protests, I think they mean a lot to a lot of the people in Palestine, showing that the world is on their side. It gives a lot of hope. So let's continue doing what we're doing and all mobilize and act for the cause. I think that's the best thing we need to do right now.
Thank you, Johnny. Susie?
Yeah, I mean, I really I agree with everything Johnny said. I do, despite the horrors, I feel hopeful, and I think that I think we're going to see an end to this apartheid regime in our lifetime. I really do. I would like to, maybe I would be really nice to have more discussions about strategy, you know, about how we as people from around the world can reach Gaza. You know, we haven't seen the boats in a while. There were boats for a long time going regular. I think now is the time to find a way to activate those and to find a way to just get there, because I think we have to physically, some of us at least have to find a way to physically get there. And there's a lot of other fronts in this country, especially legal fronts, that we have to contend with and start pursuing, because that has been a way for them to thwart us. But you know, the legal option is not always friendly to us, because I think the decks are stacked against us. There's already so much public bias and assumptions about us. But there's also, you know, there's federal judges of all walks of life, and some of them see through the BS. And you know, Suzanne, I'd love to talk to you after this actually about some of those legal aspects, and in particular, since we have a legal case now with Palestine rights that's ongoing. But yeah, sorry, this is like my bedtime, y'all. Now I'm an old lady and I'm rambling, so I apologize.
No, it's been a long day, but thank you, Susan. That was great. Suzanne, go ahead and take us home.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just reiterate everything that Johnny and Susan said, and I think, you know, we kind of have to like continue on all fronts and you know, still be kind of united in the message that this is a liberation war and we need to support the resistance and not get, you know, boggled down into some of the liberal tropes that are kind of being used to talk about this, because people don't want to be honest about what's going on. And I think that, you know, in particular, if I want to be very specific, I don't know if folks have followed Palestine Action in the UK, right, that had done some very important work in shutting down Al-Bayt arms headquarters in the UK and similar other targets. And they now have a group in the US targeting Al-Bayt in Boston. And you know, they have a page on Twitter which they're not allowing people to follow. Every time we try to follow it, it gets unfollowed and so on. So maybe take a look at what they're up to and see. I feel like that kind of thing, really trying to kind of dismantle the Zionist infrastructure like the Block the Boat did, and, you know, arms shipments and so on. I think that those are going to kind of be vital. I also really think we really need to hold the Democratic Party accountable for this. And hold the Democrats who are silent on that accountable for not holding the Democratic Party accountable. So that's it.
Great suggestion, and so much to do. And thank all of you, honestly, for giving 2 hours of your time when I know every one of you is actually doing political work before and after this meeting. And so I'm really grateful for that. I want to add some, Laurie has put in the chat, there's a national march on Washington coming up, Free Palestine, November 4th. I could be wrong, but it's the first time since I can remember that there's been a national march for Palestine in DC. I think it would be something for us to get to. I also want to say Puntorojo's next organizing meeting will be 2 weeks from tonight at this time. We're going to be talking about building decolonial Marxism. And really, this is kind of inspired by our thinking about Palestine, thinking about what Susan said about Palestine as a linchpin of global capital and trying to resurrect the great tradition of anti-colonial Marxism that helped these national liberation struggles of the past move forward. And we're thinking more about, can that be applied to Palestine now? How do we think about dismantling global capitalism? What kind of Marxism do we need? 2002. So I hope folks will get to DC. I hope you'll come back. Everyone is welcome to come back for our meeting in 2 weeks. I hope you'll follow Johnny and Suzanne and Susie, read their books, follow their work. But I thank them in the kind of virtual way that you do. You clap hands on screen. I'm really, really honored that you came. All of us are. And I hope that we will continue in conversation until Palestine is truly free. So thank you all for coming tonight, and we'll see you again.
While we listen to tunes made by ignorant fools, Israel blocked the UN from delivering food. They bring in the troops and you won't even glimpse of the news. They make money off the products that we're quick to consume. And it's not simply a question of differing views. Forget emotions, this is facts. What I spit is the truth. Makes no difference if you're a Christian or if you're a Jew. They're just people living in different conditions to you. They still die when you bomb their schools, mosques and hospitals. It's not because of rockets, please God, can you stop this all? I'm not related to the strangers on the TV, but I relate, cause those strangers could have been me. Words could never ever explain the raw tragedy. It's not a war, they're just murdering more rapidly, and we are automatically supporting pure savagery. Imagine how you feel if this was your family.